Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for staying late to join us for this wonderful panel with my guests. On the very end, we have Tess Ferrandez-Norlander, developer and data scientist at Microsoft, working primarily on machine learning with a focus on the human and societal impacts of machine learning. Beside her is Oren Novotny, the chief architect of DevOps and modern software at Insight. He is also a regional director and MVP for Microsoft. Then we have Mads Torgersen, the program manager for C# at Microsoft. He's been in that role since 2005, and he has described himself as a reluctant dictator in that role. And Mark Rendle, the founder of Rendle Labs, a software consultancy, and Mark can also be found presenting around the world at various conferences. And I am Bryan Hogan. I'm a blogger and podcaster, and I have a few talks this week. The format for tonight is going to be very simple. I've got questions for each of the panelists. I'm going to give them 3 minutes to answer, and then open it up for 2 minutes to the rest of the panelists. I've got 2 rounds of those questions, and then for the last 15 to 20 minutes, I'm hoping we'll have audience questions, and we have mics set up, I think, on both sides. Excuse me for one moment. And my first question goes to Oren. With the coming release of .NET Core 3, what are you most excited about?
So my interest and my passion is on desktop development on Windows, so I was very excited to see that WPF and Windows Forms were coming to .NET Core, enabling my applications to move forward and get all kinds of new features and goodies on the latest platform. So that was the best part for me.
But specifically, is your interest more on the WPF side, on the UI side, or are you more broad?
For me, it's mostly about the UI and UX, being able to use the latest technology and still have a UX that I can understand, because I am not an HTML person. So being able to use XAML and use Windows Forms to quickly prototype and develop applications and bring them forward is a huge boost for me. Further, being able to deploy that onto my users' machines without having to worry about whether they have .NET Framework already installed on that machine is a feature that I've already taken quite a lot of advantage of. So.
And the rest of the panel, what's your opinion of most exciting feature coming in .NET Core 3?
Personally, I'd say it's that WPF and Windows Forms are on GitHub, which means we might actually be able to fix them. Or at least contribute and kind of go, you know what, that thing in WPF, I don't really like that API, I think I can make it better, or I can make that perform a bit better or something. The ability to kind of get in there. And the other thing that kind of hangs off that is, so yes, you can create a WinForms application, you can create a WPF application, but only if you're running on Windows. And there is still not a good story for creating cross-platform native applications. Xamarin will do Mac, but if you want to have one code base that runs on Mac and Windows and Linux, you have to create an Electron app, and if you do that, everybody hates you. So, I don't expect Microsoft, certainly not in the near future, to be going, we've made new backends for WPF, but the idea that this might enable the community to come along and say, we've taken WPF, or we've taken Windows Forms, mixed it with Apple's desktop stuff, or mixed it with, GTK, or Qt or something. And so to be able to actually go, here's my WPF application, and here are builds of it for all 3 desktops, I think that could be pretty cool.
I saw a quick demo of somebody who was playing with WinForms based on the Mono code base, and actually got it working on WASM in the browser. I thought that was pretty creepy. I'm like, Windows Forms in the browser.
Yeah. That's, yes.
That's pretty much 180 degrees from where we were 5 years ago.
And Tess or Mads, have you got something that you're particularly excited about?
I think it's the I agree with these people. I mean, but it's sort of the bigger picture of it is that .NET Core is full-throated. At this point, it's not for a particular scenario. It actually sort of goes across the different things that you want to use .NET for. And it means that most people in what they're doing can get on .NET and get on .NET Core and get on that. I think what I see from the inside is the higher innovation velocity that we can have on that platform compared to the classic .NET. Our ability to move forward much more rapidly and with much more confidence for several reasons. One of them being, hey, we started over, we learned some things. Another one being it's open source. We get boosts on there. It's not just Microsoft building, it's everyone building it. And
Microsoft and Ben Adams, basically.
that is a gross simplification.
Yeah.
So I'm happy that everybody can sort of benefit from that.
And I too think the cross-platform WPF, for example, is a really good thing. In data science, a lot of that happens on Linux, or right now it's kind of 50-50, and you have to have your data collection tools and everything running on the same platforms.
So I'm going to move on to the next question from Mads. Ignoring that we sort of restarted with .NET Core, if you could wipe the slate clean with, say, C# and .NET and start completely fresh, how would you do it?
Ooh, that probably, you could probably start by looking at all the things we didn't do again on .NET Core that we did the first time around. That's a pretty good set of mistakes we won't do again. Of course, you know, the world has evolved a lot. A lot of things have been invented, but I'm surprised myself at how well .NET has held up as a as a platform, as a set of principles for how to do software development. I would not have dreamed that it would have held up so well, and I started on it 13 years ago. So it's more like specific things. Oh, I wish we hadn't done that. And I'm very language-oriented, so I wish we hadn't done covariance on interface or on array types, and wish we hadn't done anonymous methods in C#2 and then lambdas all over again. And I wish we had implemented a lot of the features we did in the language, that we had implemented them in the CLR instead, so they wouldn't generate this weird, clunky code full of edge cases and seams that show, but that we had evolved the whole platform the whole time instead of leaving the runtime alone for a decade or so before we dared add features to it again for expressiveness. So there's several things like that where I think we made tactical and strategic mistakes or read the market wrong. We probably wouldn't have done dynamic the same way either if we had known that literally sort of the next day after we released dynamic, smartphones would hit, and then smaller and smaller devices, and computing resources. The average computer would get smaller and smaller and larger and larger, and that pretty much happened the day after we released the most resource-consuming language feature ever to hit the planet. So lots of mistakes there, but I think overall it's held up pretty well.
If you could wave a wand and add some feature, what might it be?
I pretty much can,
Okay.
I think that right now I'm very, we're finishing up C#8, and it's all very tactical right now, but I'm starting to think about what's next. And I think there are some pretty interesting expressiveness things that I'd like to really move the needle with C# again. I think there are some ways that you can, ways that some of, we steal from functional languages all the time. Haskell has this notion of type classes, and there are other languages that are borrowing from that. And what that gives you, essentially, at the core, it gives you an idea of decoupling your code more, where you could build a class, and Mark could build an interface, and I could say, hey, they didn't know about each other, but I actually would like that class to implement that interface, and here's how, and I can sort of bring abstractions together in a way that's not hardwired into them. And if we can do something like that, I think that's sort of like the next explosion of expressiveness. But it's really hard to do. There's no language that completely does it right now.
And everyone else, what would you like to see if you had a clean slate?
That you just said.
Okay.
That's fine.
So structural typing, which is what TypeScript does, where you say this is an interface and someone else says this is an object, and TypeScript does the work of does that interface, or does that object implement that interface? Which I think there's something about shapes in the kind of C# lang discussion.
Yeah.
But that's the thing I'd really like. Because sometimes I don't want a dictionary, I just want something that's got a string indexer that returns a string. And it would be nice to be able to say that, but still pass in dictionary, even though you didn't implement my interface. So yeah, that would be my number one.
I'd like to have seen a more open design from the get-go if I had a time machine. Obviously, Microsoft is was not then what it is now. And I think one of the great things about C# is that it is developed completely in the open. The language design meetings are there. You can participate. So anyone that has an interest in the platform or the language is free to get involved in the community. And I think the language would have evolved a bit differently early on had feedback from the community been as readily accepted and understood.
So for me, before C#, I came from assembler, so I started loving C#, of course, the first time I met it. And that was in the alpha stages of .NET. And lately, I've been spending a lot of time in Python the last 2 years, and I still love C#, much more than I do Python. But something that is kind of easy in Python that I don't know how it works in C# is functional programming. Because when you have to deal with very big data, you have to make it very parallel. And I think that's easier in some of the languages that we use for data science.
I'm going to move us on. So Mark, from a metrics and performance perspective, what about the recent or upcoming releases interest you most?
So there's a bunch of good stuff. In .NET Core 2.2, they have opened up a bunch of the internal CLR metrics, things like garbage collector pressure and memory pressure and thread pools and so forth, which up until now in full .NET it's exposed through event tracing for Windows, and you can pick it up in performance counters, but there's no answer to that for running it on Linux or Mac. And these days I'm running most of my production .NET Core code is running in Docker containers on Kubernetes or whatever. And now you can, there's an event source, and you can hook up an event listener on that source inside your application and pull the information out and then send it wherever you want it to go. So I've got like garbage collection stats written out to Prometheus or InfluxDB. So that's really nice.
And I can hold this quite close to mine because apparently I'm not being amplified. And I'm kind of there's the diagnostic source, which is the thing I'm talking about tomorrow in room 1, which is weird. I'm going to have like 8 people going, we want to know. But yeah, so that's that. You get a lot of decent information out of that, and you can do tracing and metrics out of that as well. And I'm really hoping, it's one of the things that excites me about WPF and WinForms going open source is that I can go in and open pull requests going, you know what, it would be really useful to know when that happens and to have that going out to some sort of stream. So where I'm working at the moment, we had to hook up to the binding trace source and then pass the text that's being written to the binding trace source so that we can figure out what binding errors are happening. And it took me about a week to write parsers for all the different various formats because they're not consistent. And so I will immediately open a pull request going, you know what, let's write this out as structured data to a diagnostic source. And that will make it easier to pick up. So yeah, there's a lot more of that low-level monitoring, and that's becoming possible in a cross-platform way, and I think that's really exciting. And I'm hoping, as Microsoft put more of that in, to be able to persuade people to spend a bit more time thinking about monitoring and measuring and telemetry and so forth in their applications.
Does anyone else have an opinion? Comments to make?
That sounds really good.
All right. And for Tess, where is Microsoft now with regard to machine learning, and how much of it is .NET versus non-.NET?
So I've been kind of pondering this question because I feel a little bit like the odd one out, given that I spend a lot of my time in Python. But machine learning is a little bit more than just the model building. The model building is generally done right now, at least in Python and R. But it's also everything from data collection, IoT, it's the DevOps around machine learning, it's the data pipeline, and it's also the everything that calls machine learning models. So there's a lot of .NET around there. The problem is that I see with machine learning and .NET, for example, things like ML.NET, is that machine learning is kind of like, if you think of software engineering, the principles we work on have been kind of manifested in the 80s. We're talking about like gang of fours. These are already set things, and if you want to, you can sort of create a new language and it will work on the same principles. But with machine learning, we're in the 90s. We're kind of like in the starting point where we're doing research. Like machine learning conferences are just a bunch of people reading off research papers. And doing something like ML.NET that's supposed to be like easy and encompass like already proven patterns when something is still being developed is a little bit hard. So I kind of like to think of it a little bit like this. Like when Node came and someone, like 7 years ago, we would have never thought we would be doing like JavaScript on the server. But then someone came and said, well, you know, maybe we should use the same language on the server and the client. And we're now at the point where when the land is kind of like calm and we've done all the research and we're down to a stable thing, then I think we will want to do .NET even in machine learning. But right now I think the model building is not for C# quite yet. That's my opinion, but that might.
What do you think will get us there?
I mean, it has to settle down and become less of a playground and more of like a proper software practice. And I think we in this room, like, so the other issue with machine learning right now is that we have data scientists that don't necessarily have software practices. So, and we have software engineers that don't understand data. And we need to kind of couple together and become software scientists, I don't know what we call them, but someone who understands everything from DevOps to machine learning, kind of like adds the rigor of software engineering to data science. And I think that can happen with .NET. .NET is a lot more testable than Python, like it's a lot more easy to create like a good DevOps pipeline with C# I think.
Mads, do you have any particular insight from the C# perspective?
Yeah, I think that I agree a lot. I think that one of the things that we can do that is at least a different angle on machine learning than most people are taking right now, and I hope we will pursue that path together on .NET, is we can approach data from a developer perspective. Mm-hmm. We know about developer tools and we know about good software development practices and so on. The thing we need to do is to extend that to do cool things with great quality around data. We need to get used to the immediacy of working with live data and kind of coupling data streams up, and playing with data streams and using that as kind of our development approach. We need to have the tools and sort of the abstractions to seamlessly, gradually migrate that over to become mature applications and mature uses in applications and so on. And that's not specific to machine learning or AI. That's general for data. That's big data in general, and data is everywhere now. And we can grow our tool set from a developer mindset, which no one has that down right now. It's still mostly sort of the data scientist mindset that rules there. And I think if we can get a good general story around how we handle data from a
Because actually, I would say Microsoft is one of the few companies that work, like, this is a Python thing, so not really a C# or .NET thing, but this is one of the few companies that work with things like Azure ML for Python that allows you to have like lineage of your data, understand like basically this is what data this model was working on and all that stuff, and lineage of your runs and like putting basically the CI, CD or the DevOps into, yeah, I agree with you.
Mark and Oren, do you see any customers looking for machine learning or AI on their .NET platforms?
Just before I talk about that, hands up if you're sitting there suppressing the urge to jump up and down shouting F#. Yeah, thought so. So yeah, there is that .NET story around data science, more data science than machine learning, I think. But I think if you are running any kind of business right now and you're not investigating and researching what machine learning and deep learning and data science can do for your business, then you probably won't be in business in about 10 years' time, because someone will come along in your same vertical who is doing those things and they will just destroy you. And I think projects like ML.net, I don't know anything about AI and machine learning. It's a whole closed book to me. But I downloaded ML.net and I ran some data through it for a project that I'm working on. Here's some text, and when people have typed this in, they've added these tags, so like Stack Overflow kind of thing, and trained a model on it. And then as somebody is typing in new text, you just go to the model and say, so what tags do you think this should have? And it can auto tag. And so Stack Overflow could build this into their thing. And just as you're typing the question, it will just have filled out the tags by the time you get to the end. And that made it work for me, because it's working in a language that I know, in an environment that I know, in an IDE that I know. And I think this is going to democratize this, what has until now just been people at conferences delivering papers, and it's putting it into the hands of a whole bunch more people. And I really hope that's going to accelerate it and address some of the stuff you were talking about, and kind of open it up for people to kind of go, hey, have we tried this?
For sure.
Yeah, and I'll echo that. I know nothing about AI and ML per se. I mean, I know what they are and that they exist and that you should be careful of them in some cases. Lots of ethical dilemmas that need to be addressed. I also know that we do a lot of data science and machine learning and other big data implementations for many of our customer projects. And we do have our data scientists, and they are using languages like R and Python and those tools. But they also then need to interact with the other business systems. And those are going to be often .NET or JavaScript or some kind of visualization that a business user can consume and make sense of that, about it. And there's a bridge there where it needs to be crossed, and that's an area where .NET and some of those libraries, I think, play a pretty large part. And it also comes down to the democratization, as you mentioned, Mark, where today our data scientists are largely siloed. There's these folks over here, and they're very expensive resources. But if you can make it easier and take those patterns that need to be developed and make it accessible, then it also then becomes more affordable, and more people can add and use these techniques within their own applications much more easily.
I'm going to move us on. So, Mark, .NET Core has a lot of developments for IoT. There's the GPIO library, serial port library, and other things. Yeah. What do you think?
This relates to the other talk that I'm doing on Friday afternoon. I can plug my own talks. So yeah, and the answer to this has changed, because yesterday they released .NET Core 3 Preview 2, which has now got system.device.gpio in it. It's on NuGet, and it's 0.1 point, don't use this or things will catch fire and all your cows will die. But it's there, and I think it's really important. As Mads said, we live in a world where things are getting smaller, not bigger, and there are many reasons why that's a good thing, like battery life. Small devices that run off a watch battery, but are sitting there and they're running some kind of Linux distro and they're running .NET Core on top of it. We're just putting computers into everything, like fridges. My washing machine is on my Wi-Fi network, and when it finishes doing a wash, I get a message that comes up on the TV going, the washing's finished, which is just, what? Okay. It's good. And I think we, at the moment, if someone said, build an application that runs on a little device that sits in the corner of the room and flashes an LED when something happens, that's actually, how do you do that? You've got to kind of go, right, so I've got to work out where this pin is and how to address this pin. And it's been a solved problem with Raspberry Pis and Arduinos and all these things. They've got the GPIO standard. And now we have first-class support for that is coming in .NET Core 3. So you can actually create a little device that sits there in the corner. It could just monitor the temperature in your room, or it could monitor the amount of moisture there is in the soil in your pot plant. I have a thing, I'm going to try and sell everybody a little black box that sits in everybody's house and replaces Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter, and just the data stays in your house. But we're going to be building more and more of these things that interact with the real world, that need sensors or need some kind of simple output because they're not attached to a screen. And I think the stuff that Microsoft are doing with IoT and the Azure Edge stuff and all this sort of stuff, it can only be good. And building lovely little fun things. It's also a great way to get kids interested. If you're trying to get your kids coding, they will be much happier making LEDs light up than anything else, except maybe Minecraft.
Is anyone else doing anything in IoT?
Sure. I think IoT is an interesting intersection between the edge computing, but also with ML and applied machine learning and the models that are running with it. For one customer, we have .NET Core running ML models on a drone out inspecting railroad tracks. And these are thousands of miles of tracks in the United States that need to be inspected for damage, for buckling, for safety reasons. And they need to be able to run image recognition, but the bandwidth is such that you can't just send a continuous high-def video stream to a remote place. The ML has to happen on the drone and find the interesting pictures, the things that might have a problem, and then send those up or store those for later, depending on the bandwidth scenario.
We have the same things with like oil vessels and things like that, but I would say pretty much every ML project I've been involved in has been an IoT project to some extent.
Anything specific from the C# side, Mads?
No, I think it's cool.
So Tess, on the topic of IoT and integration with devices, so we're going to have a lot of things watching us, analyzing us, and making decisions about us. But now it even sounds like Microsoft .NET Core will be part of that greater threat, say. I know this is your key area.
I don't know if .NET Core has too much to do with it, but yeah, there certainly is a problem with like the perpetual lineup thing where sort of we're watched everywhere, and now anyone can tap in and see exactly where you are because they can do face recognition and different things like that. In fact, there was an article this summer in the UK about this one guy who was called out and basically patted down and treated like a criminal because they thought he was, like, they had basically seen him on a CCTV camera, done face recognition, and found him guilty before even looking at him, and it turned out it wasn't him. Quite a big problem in machine learning because, for example, face recognition is built on data sets that are male, pale, and stale, if I should say. Which makes it harder for face recognition to recognize women and dark-skinned people. I often get recognized as a man. I don't know, maybe I do look manly, but that is, like, I'm often gender classified as a man. And the reason is because it's not about the algorithms, it's not about the models, and that's sort of where we focus as engineers. It's about the data. And the data for most face recognition systems is Yahoo News images from 2008 to 2012. So I want to kind of like take it away from .NET, take it away from the algorithms. Don't focus on that, focus on the data instead.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else have comments or concerns about the direction of these devices, watching, monitoring? You were saying there's machine learning on your small devices.
Yeah, as I mentioned or alluded to earlier, I think that data privacy and ethical issues need to be carefully considered. It's garbage in, garbage out's the old saying, and it's even more so true in ML.
But I think it's interesting, like, so if I should toot the horn a little bit for Microsoft, if we look at the papers that comes out, because mainly there are a couple of big companies that do big data papers on ML. It's like Microsoft, it's Google, it's NVIDIA, because they own all the GPUs, and Baidu. And where Google focuses a lot on the algorithms and on that piece, and the articles or the papers that come out of Microsoft are around fairness, transparency, making machine learning interpretable, DevOps around machine learning, basically everything that takes it from the playground and from the not so rigorous to what we're used to at Microsoft, engineering in the proper way with proper software practices.
I've been very pleased to see Microsoft's stance on the use of ethical artificial intelligence and the various promises to, not do evil things with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Leave that to Amazon.
What?
Just leave that to Amazon.
Right.
So, Oren, I'm going to go back slightly to what I asked you earlier. You thought you covered it a little bit. There's a whole host of new windowing elements to .NET Core 3. But I personally, it's about 10 years since anyone has asked me to develop a desktop application. What was the rationale behind the introduction of these?
It's a very good question. Can I ask a quick show of hands here? How many folks here are writing or maintaining a Windows Forms or WPF desktop application?
Ooh,
You're in very good company.
Okay.
So at least as of the numbers I have from Ignite, there's over 2.4 million active users per month developing desktop applications in Visual Studio. That's a lot. That includes lots of the Microsoft's largest customers who depend on WPF and WinForms to run their business. So when it comes to moving the platform forward, including critical fixes like high DPI screens, they needed some changes that would break the runtime of .NET, and that's something that just can't happen. So being able to move forward on .NET Core 3 where it can be side-by-side or where it's application opt-in is a way to start moving forward, taking advantage of some of the performance enhancements and language enhancements that the C# team is doing, and just overall, moving forward. Being able to open source and consume the open source code is something that I think is only possible on the .NET Core side, again, mostly because of compatibility issues. I don't know the exact number of .NET Framework installs out there. I think it's a lot. I don't know if it's 7 digits yet. If it's in the billion, I don't know. But it could be at this point, and you can't break that. So that's one of the main reasons why the .NET Framework has had to slow down and focus in on just strictly security and compatibility fixes.
You're working on UI based?
Yeah, I was quite surprised. My current contract position, they hired me to help with microservices. I haven't written any microservices since I started. I've been doing WPF and things related around WPF. We have a tendency as human beings to assume we're normal, and therefore everybody else is doing the same things we're doing and thinking the same things we're thinking, and then 17.4 million of them vote for Brexit, and you go, wow, how did that happen? I thought we were fine. You spend 10 years kind of focusing on JavaScript and Angular and web applications and .NET Core, and then somebody turns around and goes, no, we've got, was it 2.5 4 million
Users,
developers building Windows applications. And that's active every month, kind of adding new features. That's not counting all the systems that are out there. How long was it since you were in a place like a dentist surgery or something like that, and you caught a glimpse of a screen and you went, that's Windows XP. And they're still running .NET 2.0 and they're running Windows Forms applications, and you can go to them and say, hey, you know what, you should really update to a brand new system and a whole new thing. And they're kind of going, this works. I don't need to upgrade this. But yeah, there's still desktop applications out there and they need maintaining. And until such time as Electron stops doing what it does, that's just going to continue.
But do you see it as mainly maintenance, or do you see a lot
No.
I
would be building, I am building new desktop applications, and we're very excited at work to be able to start migrating WPF and Windows Forms code over to .NET Core 3.0 so that we can get all that cool new stuff like the new system memory span and the new networking primitives and the massive improvements that have been made in so many different places without having to kind of go, we've got to throw away all this. You can't go to somewhere like one of the big banks or one of these big enterprise things and go, hey, rewrite all your WPF applications in UWP. Because they'll just go, no.
Yeah, anyone try that? Did it succeed?
No. Because, So, no, there's a huge market out there for it, and there's a lot of people who I think have been sat there for the last couple of years kind of going, I'm getting pretty sick of this .NET Core stuff. They keep getting all this awesome, cool stuff, and I want it. I want low allocation. I want these new networking things. And so it's great that they're going to get to jump on and have some of the fun that we've been having. It's great.
Mads or Tess, any?
I'm very proud that we were finally able to make a decision like that. I think it's easy to confuse stability with outdatedness. Like WPF, for instance, has been pretty good for desktop apps for a very long time, so it hasn't really been necessary to invest that much, and we could probably have invested more in it, but it's not as if it's like outdated and dead. It was just pretty good. What it really needed what it needed more than anything was investment in the underlying platform. It needed to be able to take part in those platform investments that are there in .NET Core. And so it's a very deep and very stable market. Doing desktop apps is alive and fine. We might not be in the headlines with it every day, except when we release it on .NET Core, but it's just there. And to be honest, we haven't really had a good posture around it for several years, where we haven't been able to publicly commit to continuing supporting good desktop development in a way that people were willing to believe. And I think we do that. I think it's clear that, hey, that is actually something that we're fully behind, and it's part of the future of .NET, to latch onto your panel title.
Yeah. And shameless plug, tomorrow afternoon, as it says on the slide there, I have a talk about what you can do to modernize and how to take your existing WinForms or WPF app and move it over to .NET Core. It's probably easier than you think, and it gets into that whole discussion of, why should you rewrite it as a web app or port it? Because that's a whole lot of time and effort that doesn't necessarily have immediate business value at the end of the day, and just is likely to introduce a whole new set of bugs that have been long since solved in your current application. So, if you're thinking about those lines, please come to my talk tomorrow afternoon.
I'll move on to Mads. Do you think or worry that C# .NET are becoming too complex, especially for beginners? Because we've got framework 4 point whatever. There were significant differences between that and Core 1, then we moved to 1.1, to 2, 2.1, 2.2, 3 is coming. Is it getting too difficult for people to get started or even to advance?
I think the answer has to be a little different depending on whether you're talking about the language level and the .NET level. I think .NET as a set of APIs. It's fine for a set of APIs to grow and for new things to to be added to the pile. People don't have to learn all of .NET in order to use it. They can learn their part, and if it's a different subset that's useful to you 5 years from now, that's fine. You can blot out the rest and just focus on that. I think it's harder with the language. Right? We have a very deliberate strategy around evolving C# and to some degree F# pretty aggressively. It's a choice. We have a different strategy around Visual Basic, like stability, and the stuff you already know and are comfortable with. That's kind of the focus is on having a good tooling experience there and keeping up on that side. But with C#, we've said, hey, we want to aggressively evolve C#. We want to make sure that it is still a good choice for a new project as a language today and tomorrow, just like it was yesterday. Which means because there's there's massive evolution in the whole programming language space, it means we have to try to discern. That's just a fad, but that thing is a keeper, and people really get benefit from that. How can we get something similar in C#? How can we steal that, or how can we, think about the same scenarios in a way that makes sense in a C# context? That means we do add a lot. The language grows pretty rapidly, and we try to not bloat it too much. We try to do things in a way that fits in well with with sort of like the core spirit, if you will, and then add as little syntactic overhead as possible and so on. We try. But even so, it's growing and growing. And we sort of made peace with that it is a language that is primarily, not exclusively, but it's primarily for professional developers. Right? So you like an artisan, you need a very varied toolbox, and it's okay that some of the tools are a little specialized and you have a lot of them and you need to learn how they all fit together, because you do it every day, and the ergonomics and productivity of it all, they're important to you. But it does mean that if you're coming to the language for the first time, especially if you're coming to programming for the first time and then starting out in C#, then it's a little daunting to get to learn the whole thing. I think one of the things that we have to get good at, or be good at, and I think to some degree we are, is not teaching the same subset of the language first that maybe we would have 15 years ago, but focusing on a different core C#. That we put all this effort into keeping it internally consistent, and that means that there's a different. You don't necessarily have to start with all the different kinds of integral types. Like, who uses integral types these days, and so on. We can focus on a different subset of the language, and maybe that can help make it still reasonably learnable. But it's never going to shrink. It's always going to grow. So. One day it's going to be too big, maybe.
And Tess, you were saying that you'd like to see the likes of the machine learning, AI, data scientist type people move to C# and .NET. Do you think it's an easy step?
Yeah. It's so hard to say. I grew up with .NET. Yeah. I can't really tell. It's like asking me if Swedish is hard. It's not for me.
I would say it is.
Well, I wanted to say that despite some of these new language features coming out, anyone, including beginners, can benefit from them and their impact on the platform, even if you don't have to use those particular features. Reference types and like ref of span and all those stack allocation things that have been done in the name of performance are tricky, advanced scenarios. I don't fully understand them. I turn to people like Mark or Ben Adams or other folks who are gods at this stuff. But you know what? They make the code faster and have...
I don't understand them either, dude.
So fewer or zero. I know what zero allocations means. It means that I don't have to run the garbage collector, which I know is a good thing. But I can take advantage of those as a consumer, even as a beginner, because the language was there, enabling other folks to use them in powerful ways.
That's a good point. And I think we even have like a tradition of this, right? We've had unsafe in the language forever, and this is sort of like and that's a subset of the language that most people didn't have to worry about and would rather not. And I think evolving into ref structs and ref returns and all that stuff is it's similarly, even though it's not unsafe anymore, that's sort of the big advance of it. It's still not for everyone. It's just something that is being used a lot in the layers you depend on, and therefore you run faster. Yay.
Mark, do you see a C#.NET as a hard thing to evolve with or come to?
No, I mean, I want to pick up on the subset we should start people off with now is not the subset that we would have chosen 15 years ago. So now you just take for granted that you've got things like the var keyword. So a new programmer coming along isn't going to go through those endless things where people are going, no, you have to use the explicit type and type things and everything. What I'm waiting to see is whether the people who insist that you shouldn't use the var keyword are going to be okay with the new that's coming in C# 8, where you can just go, right, fine, in that case, string builder equals new bracket bracket. How's that? Happy now? But that is a feature that's going to make it much easier for people coming fresh to the language, is to go, so I say what type I want and then I just say new. I don't have to type it on both sides. That makes sense to me, that I can make my fields, I can initialize my fields or whatever. Async and await. Yeah, okay, for us, coming from there wasn't anything, then there was threads, then there was the task parallel library with continue with, which never worked, and then there was parallel link, which does something completely different, but try persuading a junior developer of that. And then we finally got async and await. But someone coming in right now is just going to go, right, so if it's going to suspend execution, then I put async there and I await something there and I don't worry about what's happening underneath, and that's great. And so, yeah. Also, nullable reference. When you announce nullable reference types, I saw that, like, the headline thing, and I'm like, what are you talking about? Reference types are nullable. And then I saw it and I thought, well, that could be quite good. And then I downloaded Visual Studio 2019 and I turned it on and loaded a bunch of code from an old project into it, and it just went, oh no, that's going to crash all over. That is going to make life so much easier for a new developer coming in to not... Someone coming from some languages don't allow null, or they cope really nicely with things being null in a way that C# doesn't, and that's going to make life easier for them. And also now Microsoft are being less precious about the developer experience. So you've got Visual Studio, you've got Visual Studio for Mac, but you're also getting this stuff lighting up in VS Code. If you use the preview C# plugin for that, it'll light up in there. And you've got JetBrains Rider, which is what I use for most of my personal projects, and that's lighting stuff up as well. And so this is actually open to everybody on all the platforms. I think it's going to make it easier for people to write good code coming in. Probably not as easy as Python, for example.
But I do have to say something about Python and C# where I have to say C# is so much easier. Like with Python, especially, so Python you can run interactively in Jupyter notebooks, for example. And then you can run one cell and then another cell, and then you run this one again, and suddenly you don't know what you did because they ran out of order and things. But one problem that I've had in Python that I appreciate so much when I get back to C# is because Python is not a strongly typed language. I don't have IntelliSense. I do have IntelliSense, but I don't have proper IntelliSense. It's kind of quasi-IntelliSense. And with C#, I never have to guess. It's always like all the options I have are there, period.
Also, you've never had a C# program crash because someone sent you a pull request with tabbed indentation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No, we saved that for the YAML.
But
you're just bringing up things I appreciate with C#.
In the code review, going through the code review, going, yeah, that all looks fine. The invisible bugs waiting to trip you up. So yeah.
So for those of you who don't know, Python relies on your indentation for deciding when, like, it doesn't have...
Yeah, I would like to open it up to anyone in the audience that wants to ask a question. We have mics on both sides of the hall. Or if you want to shout it out, you can try that too. But sure, sir. If you don't mind, we'll have it for the recording if you have it on the mic as well.
So my question maybe for Mads and Mark that made a talk 2 years ago about core RT. So we spoke about running WinForm in Wasm in Mono. It's quite fun, and if I remember correctly, core RT was stuck because it was trying to solve some things already incoming in Wasm for Blazor. So can we have status for it? Because now I have to deploy applications that are self-contained with maybe 40 megabytes, 1,000 of DLLs, and people are like, oh shit, can we go back please to the old .NET framework for that? Because it was understandable. On the other side, we use Consul, Vault, and so the Go language allows you to have single binaries. That is maybe 8 megabytes. So is there a plan to achieve something like this?
Can I just take this one real quick? Because I'll pass it off real fast.
It's kind of associated also to the tree shaking of your code also, so maybe this is a real deal.
One of the options you have with .NET Core is both self-contained and framework-dependent options. So you don't necessarily have to deploy the full framework with every single application, but for the rest, I can pass that off here.
So there's a couple of things going on with Core RT. I don't know how much time you spend kind of talking to those guys, but so they are still pressing ahead with the native ahead of time compilation. The tree shaking's not great, and so it'll take your 40 megabytes of DLLs and it will turn them into one 40 megabyte exe. But it's still just an exe, and you can zip it, and I don't think anyone's really going to complain about 40 megabytes of space being used on their disk. They have a new thing that's sort of related, which is bundling all the DLLs into the assembly and then kind of extracting them when you run the application, but it still runs as a standard .NET thing, so this is like a new packaging thing. But from conversations I may or may not have... Oh, I'm not an MVP anymore. From conversations I've had, and I'm no longer under an NDA, they were hoping to get the core, the whole native AOT thing sorted in the .NET Core 3.0 timeframe. So you could build a self-contained exe for Windows that also didn't have to JIT. Because a lot of the startup time of a Windows Forms application or a WPF application is
keep
jitting.
An eye out on the GitHub repo. All of the stuff for Core CLR and Core RT and some of those topics are on GitHub in the .NET org. There's a designs repo where some of these specs are there, and some of these topics are included, even at early phases.
It is very much alive. It is possibly not getting invested in as much as some of the other streams. But if you were in my Core RT talk 2 years ago, you'll be very pleased to know that the last time I did it, I took an ASP.NET Core 2.1 application.
So you could use IOC?
Yes, the IOC worked. They basically, they've put a lot of stuff into .NET Core 3 that just booleans on types to say, is this supported? And so one of those things is JIT supported on this platform? And so the AOT build will be able to go, no, it's not. We're ahead of time here, and you can just go, right, fine, we'll use activator.create instance, but we won't try and use il.emit or build an assembly using Roslyn and load it in. So it's definitely something that I think they're pushing for. And I think with stuff like IoT, you can spin Linux up on a Beagle Bone Black or a Raspberry Pi W0, but do you really want to be jitting on something where it's got a watch battery that's maybe going to last a week? If you can have that all natively compiled and tree shaking and everything else, and I think that is something that Microsoft are interested. They want C# and .NET running everywhere.
So it's worth testing again?
Yeah, have another look.
If I have a full cover of test and load test to be sure that something is not waiting for me to blow up.
Yeah, it's definitely worth looking at. The other thing you'll notice if you look on Core RT is people are opening issues and saying there's a performance regression when we run the Tech Empower benchmarks against a Core RT build. So if they care enough to run the Tech Empower benchmarks against a Core RT build, then that says something about their commitment to the technology and the project. So, but yeah, give it another go.
Yeah, so I'll give a Microsoft answer, which is that there's been a lot of investment in Core RT as a technology, and it's not even the only AOT .NET we have, right? Because there's also Xamarin targeting Android, for instance, and so we now have these multiple AOT technologies in the house. And I think while we've done a lot of technological investment in Core RT over now many years, I think the sort of strategic setting for it, or what's it for, has been shifting around a little. And I think we haven't had enough clarity about how does this fit into the overall .NET story. And to be fair, the overall .NET story has changed a lot over the past couple of years. And so I think the thing we have left to do is to rationalize JIT and ahead of time technologies with each other. There's this coupling to the scenarios where there are more limited or constrained scenarios where you can't do everything because you're in a tiny little thing and whatnot. And how, we still sort of need to do more in order to, have a more cohesive story, choices that make sense and that you can rationally make when you choose how you target your .NET apps, and then actually building the fitting it all together. That's yet to come. I will say that I think our focus, we expected our focus to be more on that than the whole .NET Core and Windows thing happened, and .NET Core 3.0 became more about that. But we're behind that. We've been working towards that for a long time, and I think if all goes well, at least the ambition for us is to have a much more rationalized story that is more of a continuum between JIT and AOT, between targeting framework versus self-contained, between constrained and full. There'll be a lot of thinking about that going forward.
Anyone else?
Sorry, it's not often that you get to sit on stage next to the guy who's doing C# and remember all those annoying things you wanted to say to him. But one thing that would make AOT much better, because there is this issue that we can't do dynamic code gen, but of course we wouldn't need to do dynamic code gen as much if you'd add hygienic procedural macros to C#, because then we could do them as part of the build process. So that would be awesome. Can I open an issue for that? Or will it just get closed?
Please open an issue.
Oh, yes. Right.
And then send a pull request.
I'll do it like Rust.
This sounds like a good offline discussion. I want to see what you have in mind.
Anyone got other gentlemen there? If you can make it to the side, it'd be great. If you can't, well, thank you.
So I have a question for Mats. So you said that .NET and C# is only ever going to grow. Is there really no chance that you're ever going to deprecate parts of the language or the framework, like the non-generic collections, or what you mentioned in the beginning, the anonymous delegates, for example?
Well, I think we could more easily deprecate parts of the framework, but there's not much reason to, because they're not really harmful sitting there, just being there for the occasional legacy code that still depends on it. Like, why make life hard for people? The place where it's harder to deprecate things is in the language, and that's unfortunately also where we want to do it more. I mean, it's becoming very, very hard to design new features in C# because they keep bumping up against syntax that's already taken. It's just that we spend an inordinate and disappointing amount of our time as language designers figuring out how to fit this in without breaking anything. But I think it's just the price of doing business. We don't really, well, maybe, you know, if you look at Visual Basic, which has another, depending on how you count, it has another between 1 and 4 decades on C# in terms of how long the language has lived. And it's been broken and reimagined several times along that trajectory. And we have deprecated some things that came in from VB6 and nobody uses anymore and so on. So maybe eventually we'll get there. But it's just, you just cause so much pain when you break things. And it has to be really, really worth it.
I mean, remember .NET Standard 1 or .NET Core App 1 or, you know, what was that, the Windows 8 .NET Core? They tried deprecating, that was the attempt at deprecating framework code, and everybody rightfully complained that, oh my God, my stuff doesn't work, and now you're making me rewrite all of my nasty reflection code for what reason again? So yeah, that's...
Yeah.
I saw one other hand.
Also,
if you don't mind
just
going to the mic.
While you're doing that, hash table is really useful. Because if you do the pattern where you say, if dictionary dot doesn't have this value, lock if dictionary dot doesn't have this value, that will come back and bite you if you do that with the generic dictionary of KT. But you can do it with hash table, and it's perfectly legit, and it's a big performance boost if you're caching stuff. So yeah, you think these things are not necessary, but almost because they're so primitive, they are actually still really useful in a lot of cases. So
I will say,
please don't take hash table away.
Before you ask a question, we can go over by about 5 minutes if anyone wants to ask other questions. So please go to the mic, and we will stick around for about 5-6 minutes.
10 minutes.
Oh.
15.
No, we have something else.
Oh, there's a boat thing.
We're up here till they carry us away.
So please.
Where the boat leaves.
Okay, so this is about .NET Standard, and it feels like it's actually fragmenting .NET rather than cementing it. So we've got an application that's a Xamarin Forms app, runs Android, iOS, UWP. We're using an API that's in the .NET Standard, runs fine on UWP, throws a not implemented exception on iOS and Android. Now, how can the .NET Standard have an API that throws a not implemented exception on a platform that claims to implement that version of the .NET Standard? And I've raised a bug 2 years ago, and it's just sat there doing nothing.
This sounds like a Mads question.
Yeah, I'm going to go Mads on this one again.
Which API was that? Do you remember?
It's system service model, add endpoint behaviors to a WCF client. So it is part of .NET Standard 1.2 on.
WCF is in .NET Standard? I did not know that.
Yeah, system.service model.
The service model stuff is, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
So I have no knowledge of the concrete case. It's it's unfortunate. It does sound like one of those like late night, we ran out of time kind of things. When you claim to implement something and what you do is throw not implemented. Yeah. I mean, it's something that we occasionally do to kind of like fit things that we think are coming soon or whatever. It's a flexibility kind of mechanism to have, but if it's been going on for a long time, I can see how that's annoying. Now we're just lying a little bit to you about whether this implements the standard or not.
There's other examples of .NET Standard 1.3 through 1.6 work on .NET 4.6.2, apart from all the assembly binding issues, which means you actually have to run your application on .NET 4.7.2 runtime or compile it as .NET Standard 2. So the whole .NET Standard is just too rough around the edges for you to actually reliably say, I target the standard and it will run everywhere that claims to target the standard.
Also, .NET Standard 2.0 wasn't properly implemented by .NET 4.6.1, so now you have to build for .NET 4.6.1 as well.
So until the .NET Standard does run on every platform that claims to implement it, it's still a case of you need to actually test every platform you claim you need to that claims to implement it.
I know exactly who to go back to Microsoft and bug about this, so I will take that. Yeah, feel free to send me an email and with some text in it too about the specific things. I'll definitely take that back.
I think it's also fair to say though that there are classes in the .NET framework that are implementations of interfaces that will throw a not implemented exception. There's a reason not implemented exception exists. And so, yeah, you got not implemented and not supported, because sometimes you just go, you know what? So like some of the streams, there's forward-only streams, and if you try and set position on a forward-only stream, it won't let you do it, because you can't move around in it, because it's a network stream. So it is valid for things to say, I implement this interface, but I don't implement that bit of it. And so there always has to be some level of you have to check. Obviously, you've been bitten by something really annoying.
I will add that the current versions of all of the platforms are supporting .NET Standard 2.0. .NET 4.7.2 is the recommended .NET framework for that. 4.8 is, in beta. There's previews out there for that. There's also the UWP supports .NET Standard 2 as of 16.299. I think that was RS3. So that's been a couple of years, almost 2 years now that UWP has supported it. And the Xamarin platforms absolutely support .NET Standard 2.0. So that is...
Apart from some bits, it sounds like. Yeah, let's talk about getting the concrete examples from you, and I'll ask around and see what the story is there.
I think no one else is lining up.
I've got a question, but I'll just borrow Mark's.
Okay. Man with a plan.
One of the most interesting new technologies recently is the Blazor technology that Steve Sanderson's working on, and now is part of the ASP.NET core team, I believe. Are there plans to make the core platform run on WASM rather than Mono to support that?
I don't know either.
If you look at some of the stuff outside of Microsoft, there's the Uno project, for example, which is uno.platform, I think, or platform. Anyway, this is a thing that lets you write a UWP application and then build it for Android, iOS. They're thinking of supporting Mac, but they're also starting to target WebAssembly, so you can download that and run that in the browser. So yeah, there's definitely moves towards that, and it all seems to be based on Mono at the moment, the WASM stuff. Obviously, Core RT's got WASM as a target. WASM. WASM, the word's lost all meaning. Oh wait, no, it never had one. I think WebAssembly is a big deal, and I think as we get better at tree shaking the stuff, I was very surprised when I saw how Blazor actually works, because I assumed it was just doing something clever and producing WASM, and then that was it. But it's not. He's just built, he being Steve, just cross-compiled the Mono runtime to WebAssembly and downloads that, and then downloads IL assemblies and runs them in the browser. And then somehow now we've got that doing, you can step debug through your C# in Chrome because he's downloading the PDB files as well. It's just nuts. And how it can not be the future of web development, I really don't know. And I think
Back to the Future, it's Silverlight 6, come on.
It is. I mean, so I did, just to see if I could, banks have enormous problems with JavaScript because of the numbers, basically. And you see these terrible attempts. There is a library that treats numbers as strings, and he's re-implemented the whole of math in text handling because JavaScript can't be trusted to round a number up. And I thought, I wonder if I could just write about 15 lines of Rust and compile it to WebAssembly and download it into the browser and use it to do proper banker's math. And yeah, you can, because WebAssembly, if the language you use to build something is strongly typed or statically typed, then that's it, it's done. the stuff that's down here is literally just machine code. It's just machine code that's interpreted by a browser. So yeah, and I think C# is one of the languages that's best positioned to take advantage of this, especially with the AOT stuff.
Yeah, I think whether some of the technology choices that were made initially, whether they stick or not, as these things mature, we'll find out. But I think, WebAssembly itself is very interesting because it seemed like it could never work, but the name was just so good. People knew exactly they had, it just evokes the right ambitions. Just WebAssembly. Okay, it's assembly, but it's on the web. It's something you can target and you can run stuff just like you can on other assembly. It just evokes all the right ambitions, and people double down on it and make it faster and bigger and smarter, and at some point it's realistic, right? And also because the prize, the thing we get out of it is so enormous. Think about, now how long has Java had an effective monopoly on running, JavaScript had an effective monopoly on running in the browser, right? And we can end that. We can actually...
Yes, end JavaScript!
It's fine for it to keep running, but side by side with the rest of us. Like, that's an amazing turn of events. It's such a change that will come from that as this technology matures. So I think it is really, really exciting. It's one of those game changers.
But has there been any discussions about the core runtime, though, run it against?
Yes. Yeah, of course.
I think on that hopeful note, I'm going to call it a night. Thank you to Tess, Oren, Mads, and Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you.